All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming to ARIA, the good parts, among so many other interesting talks today. I hope to tell you a little bit more about how to approach web accessibility with ARIA. I'm super pleased to be back in Porto. I came here for the first time in April with my family. They absolutely loved climbing all the stairs, and that's what I've been doing yesterday as well. It's such a lovely city to be in. I've come here from Rotterdam in the Netherlands, is where I live. And yeah, I want to talk to you about the good parts of ARIA, because whenever I talk about ARIA with my accessibility friends, colleagues, they seem to be very skeptical of what ARIA is and what it can do. And I am somewhat skeptical myself as well. But I know that ARIA exists, so there must be good parts. It was invented at the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C, who I know to be people that care very deeply about accessibility. So the fact that this exists must have good parts. It must have good parts. But it has somewhat of a reputation, because most accessibility specialists and people who do audits like myself, they've seen lots of ARIA that they aren't very happy about. And part of that is that ARIA alone will not make your app more accessible. That's a big takeaway, I think. It's important to note. It's somewhat of a negative sentiment, I guess. I don't know if you've seen this meme of someone pouring a huge bottle of dressing onto a salad. So the bottle says ARIA, the salad says accessible website. There are lots of memes like this, and I appreciate them. I also think they're somewhat negative, and I think we don't need to be negative necessarily, because, like I said, there must be good parts. So today I hope to tell you about those and get you some kind of frame of reference for you to get started with ARIA and use it well. Now, I know that talking about the good parts is something that marketeers do quite a lot. I don't know if you've seen this movie poster. It's for the film Legend, and it's got lots of 4- and 5-star reviews. But between the heads of these two people, you see one review that has 2 stars, and it looks like the other stars are just covered by the heads. Except they're not, because if you look at the review in the actual Guardian, it's got 2 out of 5 reviews. So they've managed to show their good parts, the 4 and the 5s, and hit their bad ones. And that's something that we know also of oil companies. I don't know if you've ever looked at websites of oil companies, but they all, without any exception that I could find anyway, talk about their goals to reach net zero CO2 emissions. And I applaud them for that. That's a really good thing to be focusing on. I wish we were all focused on that more. But what they don't talk about is that they spend the majority of their budget on things that actually increase CO2 emissions, as we all know. And they have it somewhere, right, on their website. It's probably in the financial statements and stuff. But they're somewhat hiding it. I aim not to do that today. I'm not going to hide the bad parts of ARIA, but I do want to give you a sort of positive overview of what the sort of things are that you can do and make the web better for users. So we'll do it in 3 acts, the first one being what and why. So I'll give you some history of why does this even exist. We'll talk about what I think the good parts are, and then we'll go into the bad parts too. I want to ask you, though, who has used ARIA before? Who used it? That's a lot of hands. OK, that's awesome. Who of you is a front-end developer? Also quite a few people. Cool. Yeah, ARIA can be used by anyone, right? And if you don't use it yourself, you've probably come across it in code bases. So I hope this is still helpful for you. Now, without introducing myself, I guess I can't do this talk, so I'll explain who I am. I work in developer relations and accessibility at a project called NL Design System at the Dutch government. And what we're trying to do is create a greatest hits of government design systems. Because there's lots of design systems within the government, more than I want to admit. There's really a lot, and they all have kind of varying degrees of quality. So what we're trying to do is find the ones that are actually very good. And then we have a process for deciding what good looks like. It needs to be accessibility audited, usability tested, et cetera, et cetera. I'm also a participant at this group called OpenUI at the W3C. It's a community group that works on introducing new elements to HTML that makes it easier to style the web platform. If you want to know more about that, grab me in the break, because I won't be covering much of it today. And I'm part of the CSS working group as an invited expert as of very recently, so that's very new. And I have my own blog. I just put it there because I do want to recommend, if you don't have a blog, get one. It's a fantastic thing to have as a developer because it can help you structure your thoughts and defragment your brain, as I like to refer to it. Here's a picture of my blog. You can make it look whatever you want. It's on hidde.blog. And then lastly, I have slides online. There's a QR code even, and I put that on there just because there might be a lot of people that have English as their second language, so you can read along if you prefer to do so. And they are online, so you can find them there. OK, so the what and why of Way ARIA. One more meme, just ARIA won't make your app more accessible, right? So here is water pouring out of a hole, and someone is trying to put duct tape on it, and that's named ARIA. Web accessibility is really about how people use the web. That's a common theme I'll be referring to a lot in this talk. It's about people, ultimately. And how people use the web is very much outside of the control of us as developers. That's something that took a bit of time for me to actually realize that. It's about how people use the web, and we don't know how they're going to do it. People might come to our website and zoom in on our website. We don't have any control over that. There was ways that you could actually stop that, but people can zoom in on your website, and they will do it. They can come to your website and turn on high contrast mode, and that could mean that part of your colors are not actually going to be what you specified, but it's going to be overridden by the browser. Sometimes people prefer reduced motion. Some people don't use a mouse, so they might be using a keyboard, or they might be using any number of different tools that allow them to access the web in ways that they are used to. So a lot of people don't use a mouse. And that means when you're building UIs, like if you're building some kind of slider, maybe you think people are going to drag the slider, and in your team, that's how you talk about it, like, oh, when the user's dragging, this is what we're going to do. But you also need to make sure it works with a keyboard, so you can do it with arrow keys just as well as you can do it with the mouse. Some people also use their website using assistive technologies, meaning that they can use their voice to control what they do on your site or your app. So they can overlay a grid, for instance, and say, I want to click on C8. And then that's going to happen. Has all sorts of implications for how your user interface works. Some people use braille displays, like the one here in the middle, that translate everything that happens on the screen in real time into braille. Really cool. And there's screen readers that read out everything that happens on the screen. So lots of different technologies, and people will use these to come to your site. So sometimes product teams that I'm in, people will ask, like, who is going to use our website like that? Do we have light users? You do. And if you don't, you can't control that you don't. Unless you make your website for just the one person, it's still very likely that it's going to be used by other people too. That is just a fact of like how the web works. It's going to be very hard to avoid people using your site in the ways that they want. Now, the thing with these assistive technologies is that they need to understand what happens on your website, in your app, in order to convey it to users. So for a screen reader to read out what happens on your screen, they need to understand what's going on. And they do that based on stuff that's in your website. So all websites expose so-called accessibility meta information. Even if you've never thought of that, it is also in your website. So when you look at any random website, you can go and look for this accessibility meta information using DevTools. It's exposed today as the accessibility tree or meta information. You can find it as part of Chrome DevTools and all of the others as well. So when, as an auditor, I look at the website, I look at what I see visually, and then I go into the accessibility info and check. And I see, OK, that's a link. It's got a name of world. It's got a row of link. I see another one. It's called US politics, and it's also a link. It's nothing to get into that one. There's also a row of button, which is called open menu. This is not actually a factual representation of that website, but that's the kind of stuff that you'll find when you look for accessibility meta information in a site. All websites expose it. And a developer's choices can really influence how the quality of that information is. So where it said world news on the CNN website, you could put a completely different word there that doesn't represent what's on that page, and that could annoy users quite a lot. So there's a lot of influence that you have as a developer. Now, with ARIA, getting back to the main subject, you can set and augment accessibility meta information. So that's the kind of stuff you can augment. So what is the role? What is it called? That sort of thing. This gives you tremendous power, and with great power comes great responsibility. A quote that I originally attributed to Spider-Man, but I recently learned that the original person speaking those words was actually Jesus. Do with that information what you want. So ARIA is an ontology for accessibility meta information. And an ontology is basically a naming structure. If you do backend work, you probably come across that quite a lot. So it's a defined structure. What do we call this stuff? That's how it is defined in the ARIA specification. So we're an ontology for information. And the ontology looks like this. It's got roles, it's got states, and it's got properties. And collectively, they're referred to as accessibility semantics, or meta information, as I like to call it. And these things are part of roles. So states and properties are supported by certain roles. That's kind of how it works. Now, these things exist in our HTML. Like I mentioned, they will be there even if you don't think about them, because they'll just be there. If you use links, you'll have things that have roles of link. They also exist in our SVG, XML, JSX. They can be anywhere. ARIA is agnostic as to which language it's used on, so it doesn't really have to be HTML. It can be other languages too. And it can be with or without ARIA attributes, so you can add ARIA to augment this stuff, and if you don't, there will also be this information still. And sometimes it's impacted by our HTML and also by our CSS. So this meta information exists, and it leads to interface affordances for end users. This is basically how our work impacts users. So if they're using a screen reader or a voice control or a braille display, the information that these tools have to their knowledge, like the knowledge that they have available, comes from that information. So the code of our website affects basically the user's UI. And when I say the user, I always need to try and remind myself that there is no such thing, right? So there are a lot of different people, a lot of different tools. So I often catch myself saying, a screen reader user is going to do this. I might do that during this talk, and then I want you to look very skeptical at me, because that's not something I actually know anything about, right? Even within the group of people who use screen readers, there's people who are blind, there's people who are not blind, and then within the people who are blind, there's people with this setting turned on or that setting turned off. So there's lots of variety, and that sometimes can make it hard to work in accessibility, and specifically as a developer, because you don't really know, what to do. But rest assured, because your job is basically to make sure the information is there, it's good information, and then the tools will take it from there, and they'll do stuff with it. And maybe you want to know kind of what the support looks like, but that's kind of where your responsibility stops. As long as you realize, like, there's lots of different tools, and it is going to be used in lots of different ways. So here's an example of an accessibility tree. We've got main and then form underneath with 3 items in it. So there's a radio button called round trip, which is selected. There's a slider called departure time that can be between 0 and 24. It's set to 7. And there's a button called search, and you can press it. This is what accessibility meta information will look like in the browser. Now browsers can do whatever they want with it. You can probably imagine many different UIs for this kind of information. Like sliders can look many different ways. Here's a slider I found in Paris Metro. It's a thing that you need to roll, that vertical bar there at the bottom, in order to make your selection. I found it somewhat weird, but it is a way to select a time. Could be an example of that. Just imagine, like, there's lots of different ways that this information can be used. Okay, so in summary, ARIA is an ontology for accessibility meta information, and it's a way for devs to augment it, because it comes with attributes that you can use in your HTML. It affects users because their AT relies on this information in order to know what's going on. And it's also used for other things, like personalization. There could be people with cognitive disabilities that could benefit from pictograms and icons that are used instead of certain UI elements. There's a whole bunch of research around around that I won't go into today. But it can affect users in different ways. And why are not all parts good? Because there's a lot of nuance to it. And that nuance is often ignored, causing the weird memes that I showed earlier, and causing accessibility people to be annoyed when ARIA is used wrong. But we'll look at how to use it well, looking at the good parts of ARIA. So let's dive into them. Now, these are all parts that I think when you use them this way, they're actually very helpful for end users. A couple of caveats. So ARIA can only benefit users when the properties are well supported, meaning that they're supported across the tools that people use. So where I mentioned earlier, you don't know what tools people are going to use, it's still helpful to look at what are kind of common screen readers and do they actually support the properties. It also means that they're consistently supported, so not differently across all the different tools. Sometimes it can be OK, but sometimes that's really a source of maybe we shouldn't be using this because it's supported quite differently in different places. Another important thing to note about ARIA is that it's most beneficial when used alongside of other accessibility requirements. Because there's a lot to do about accessibility that isn't ARIA, right? You need to do your ARIA, that's accessibility meta information, but then there's a bunch more things that make something accessible. So like if I make a button with a div role of button, that's just going to paint a square if I have some CSS applied to that. I need to give that an accessible name by putting some content in it. I need to give it color contrast. I need to give it focus indication when it gets focus. I need to give it keyboard support. Do you know what keyboard support a button needs? It's like space and enter, and depending on things like it is in a form or not, zoom support, and then also high contrast mode support. So there's lots of other things that affect accessibility badly or well, like in a good way, besides the ARIA that you want to be adding. So ARIA is just one part of the puzzle, but it can be a good part of the puzzle. So let's look at those. Like, what are the things that actually are going to add some value for end users? And I want to start with landmarks. They are a part of ARIA that allow you to say which parts of your UI are somewhat important. So you can think of it as like, oh, I'm in Porto. There's this bridge. That's very famous. I want to see it. It's a landmark. There are also things that aren't landmarks. So if you look at it like this venue, the room downstairs, there's a lot of seats here, but they are not really landmarks. The landmarks would be like, OK, here's the stage, here's the registration desk, here's the toilets. That's the kind of stuff you want to know about. You don't want to necessarily identify every single chair in the auditorium. So when it comes to defining landmarks, you want to pick the stuff that's actually important, because if you pick too many, the list of landmarks will be very long, and it will be really hard to navigate across them. So when you're using landmarks, you could use a heading and refer to that heading as a way to name it. So a nav element and a side element, but also header, footer, section, search, and form. Search is very new. They are all different landmarks. So whenever you use any of these elements, what you're doing is you're saying, this is important. It's not just a chair, it's the stage, or it's the toilets, or it's the food, right? You want to identify the stuff that actually matters. So landmarks how? Only the most important ones. Label them. So you want to, for instance, here I've labeled them by saying this heading names the landmark. And how that shows up is when someone uses a screen reader, it's going to read out, oh, there's a navigation called on this page, and there's an aside called filters. That's helpful because without that name, still not super helpful to know that there's an aside. And they all have HTML elements at this time. Search is the newest one, so they have the landmark stuff built in. There are other ways you can do it with attributes, but they have HTML elements, which is cool. And the reason you want to use it is because some users navigate by landmarks. So they can, in the screen reader, can open a menu that lists all the landmarks on the page. So that allows people in your super complex page to go directly to the search form or directly to the filters. And that's very helpful for some users. Not everyone uses that. ARIA expanded is the next one. So that is a state that is set on a button that expands something, and it basically says whether the something is open or not. So if I have a little toggle tip here and I click on a button to open it, that button can have an ARIA expanded state of whether that's visible or not. Another example is when you have like a details element, so you click a thing and it opens more content. That can also be expanded or not. Now, this is most helpful for elements that toggle, because then there's an actual difference in the state. And the browser gives it to you for free, which is nice, with the details and summary elements in HTML. So it will make it collapsible without needing any JavaScript, which is kind of cool. And also for popover, which is a very new thing, but it allows you to build popover-like elements, and it will manage that state for you, which is kind of nice. Now, the reason you want to convey this information is that it's very visual, so anyone who can see these slides will know, oh, OK, that's open, that's closed. But that information needs to be somewhere in your HTML so that tools can expose it. So a user can know that they are on a tooltip that's open or closed. Maybe the tooltip has their pin code, and they're sitting behind a computer with their friend. They want to know that their pin code is not currently visible, that sort of thing. Then ARIA pressed is another one that's fairly straightforward. ARIA pressed is set when you're building something like a toggle, and then you're setting the state of that toggle. So for instance, if you're listening to music, and this is Hiromi's latest Tiny Desk concert, really recommend it. I wouldn't actually mute it, but if you were to mute it, there is a mute button there. When you click it, it's muted, and when you click it again, it's unmuted. So that's a typical example for ARIA pressed, because you're setting the state and kind of unsetting it and setting it and unsetting it. It has two states. Another example is on LinkedIn. If you like something, you can also unlike it, and then like it again, and then unlike it. If you look on LinkedIn source code, you'll actually find that they set that ARIA pressed there right on that button. So it's mostly used when you're toggling between true and false, and that's the attribute values that you would use for ARIA pressed. And again, just like ARIA expanded, it conveys a visual state programmatically. So if you can see this, you can see that the button is pressed or not. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the UI is so badly designed that it's actually really hard to distinguish, but OK. You want to convey that to your code so that someone who cannot see it will actually know whether it's pressed or not. Next one is ARIA label. ARIA labeled by is somewhat controversial because you can have lots of other ways to label stuff in HTML that don't require ARIA. But let's say you are in a situation where it is required. Here is a booking form for a train website. So it says London St. Pancras in the one field, and then I can fill out the to in the other. So it's like from and to. And there's a button that allows me to swap between these. It has no visible label, and it needs a name. So what you can do there is add ARIA label and then put a name in there. You can also use ARIA labeled by. It does a similar thing, but instead of saying this is the label, you're saying the label is whatever is in that element. So in this case, there is a section that has a heading, ideas for your next trip. So I can say this section is labeled by that heading, and now it has a name. So when I'm browsing this website, it will read out to me, oh, there's a section with ideas for your next trip. Go and have a look. So ARIA labels are useful when we've run out of other naming techniques. It's best when you're using unique and to-the-point names, because they get read out, so you don't want lots of content in the name. And you want to avoid also the difference between the ARIA label and the visual label. And I'll show you an example of that. So here I've got a button that has the word menu in it. So visually, there's the word menu. Now, if I use an ARIA label of open the hamburger thing, then there's a mismatch between what the name is in code versus what it is visually. So when I tell my friend, oh, I'm just going to click the hamburger thingy thing, and then my friend sees the button, and they're like, no, it says menu. You could get disagreements. And you can also get these disagreements if you're using tools like voice control. So if you're telling your browser to click the menu button, but the browser thinks it's called the hamburger thingy button, then it's not going to click on the thing. So their mismatch is to be avoided. And label and name is actually a WCAG violation for that. So if you do this right, you meet that part of the WCAG standard. There's a lot more to say about how things are named exactly, because there's a bit of a difference between if you do that on buttons and links versus landmarks, for instance. So if you want to know more about that, read this tweet by Eric Echard. Again, I've included all the links with my slides, so you can browse it there. But there's a lot of differences that are somewhat subtle. So why would you want to use ARIA labels? Well, basically because the users can navigate more easily if there are consistent names for everything. And the lack of names is actually one of the things I find most when I do WCAG audits. And it affects users quite a lot. So if the name is bad or it's missing, that's a huge problem for users. Moving on to ARIA described by. So in addition to a name, you can also give a description. It's a bit like a name, but it's usually a bit longer. And an example of when you would use that is a error message that comes with a field. So a field has a label, that's the name, and then it can have a bit more text, like an explanation of how to use it, or an error message. And that's a really good way to associate the error message with the rest of the field. So when a user uses their tab key and they use a screen reader and they end up on your field, they will hear what's wrong with it in the case that it's wrong. And that's really helpful. So that relationship is also helpful for users to make. One more example is ARIA current. This is basically to identify the one thing that's current within a set of elements. So for instance, if you have a navigation, it's the current item. If you have a breadcrumb, it's the last item. So maybe not so helpful because it's always the last one. And pagination, the current item within that set. Now that's something, again, that's very clear visually, but if you're using a screen reader and you can't see the screen, then maybe you want to know what the current item is. So again, it makes the visual state programmatically available. It is better than visually hiding some content. Like you could put the word current in there and visually hide it. But then if you're going to translate your site, you need to translate that word, not forget about it because that's common. And also, you might be using a word that's different from what, say, a screen reader would actually do by default. So you're kind of messing with user expectations there. And the cool thing of ARIA Current is that it is also well supported. Moving on to ARIA Live. ARIA Live allows you to convey that something is happening within the page that needs immediate attention. So an example that we have in Dutch government websites, if you've logged in using the Dutch government login, that will log you out after 15 minutes. So the thing that you need to do is tell the users after, say, 10 minutes that this is about to happen. Because maybe they're doing a tax return that's going to take them 3 hours. They're halfway. You don't want to kick them out of their session because then they can't submit their form. And they will only find out after they've typed all their info. So you can show that. It's very important. It's also a bit annoying, but it's annoying in the way that, like, my alarm this morning was annoying when I wanted to sleep. I need to wake up, so the alarm helps me, but it's also annoying. So you don't want to set alarms for people all the time. You don't want to interrupt their flow. But in this case, yeah, they would be logged out, and that's a bit of an emergency. So important to do that. Another example is when you're doing some shopping online and you add something to the shopping cart. Sometimes the shopping cart will update. So in the right top corner, you'll see a shopping cart icon that now says 1 because I've added something to the cart. That might be information that's also helpful to tell users about, that this has now changed. It has successfully added it to the cart. So yeah, that's helpful too. So ARIA Live is for cases where you want to convey that something changed in a page that maybe people wouldn't have found out about otherwise. You can also use the output element for nameable polite regions. Mostly works. There's a good blog post that I've linked here by Scott O'Hara. Another couple of pitfalls here. So you don't need to focus the live region because it's already going to be read out automatically. And be really careful with how many times you trigger an announcement because they can be disruptive. Now, the reason you want to do it is kind of like all of the other ones. Something is marked clearly visually that there's a change happening, and you want to make sure it's also conveyed programmatically. Moving on to ARIA hidden. So the way you would use that is not on focusable elements, and you don't want to confuse screen reader users. So basically what you do with ARIA hidden is you take an element out of the accessibility tree. So you say, okay, that's there visually, but it doesn't need to be conveyed to screen reader users or anyone else. And that's sometimes something you want to do, maybe with an icon that's not very relevant. Redundant content, basically. It's quite different from role equals presentation, sometimes used in tandem with that, because role equals presentation will just remove the current role, and it won't remove the whole thing. So we've covered a bunch of different things: landmarks, ARIA expanded, pressed, labels, descriptions, current, live, and hidden. Now these are all things that I think are somewhat safe to use once you know how they work. And then there's the more complex widgets. There's a bunch of those in ARIA, and maybe you've built some of these as well, like tab panels or autocompletes, and I can see some faces look like, whoa, that's quite an adventure. Yes, it is quite an adventure. As Sarah Higley said in her blog post about this, talk to your kids about ARIA before it's too late. The thing with these complex widgets is that there are a lot of variables. So like the button I showed earlier, there's a lot of things that you need to do in addition to setting the right ARIA attributes. And there's quite a few different things that you're using together that have rules applied to them as well. So like you can't do nesting with certain types of things. And there's lots of kind of problems that you could cause when making complex widgets. So they are uniquely different from the properties I talked about before. But I'll give you one example of a widget that's somewhat straightforward, which is in this CMS, there is a menu that you can open, and it has a bunch of buttons there where you can replace and upload images. If you want to build that, you would probably give that a role of menu. Then within that, each item would get a role of menu item. And what you're saying there is like, these are items that are part of my menu. Above there is also the word replace, which is kind of like a heading. It's not an item of the menu, so you want to take care of that. But in addition to kind of setting these roles with ARIA, you also need to build a roving tab index, which means that only one of the items within there, they're all buttons, so normally all focusable. You take away the focusability from all elements but the current one, so that users can use then their arrow keys to navigate across these items. So it navigates with arrow keys, but also with escape, with enter, with home, with end, with tab, with space, and with all printable characters. So lots of things to worry about when you're building this, and lots of things to test. But then when you have the test in place, it's actually quite nice and testable. So yeah, you can build these, but do take care when building them. When you're building complex widgets, it's important to do your research, because a lot of these complex widgets don't actually work very well for end users, and they're often overused. Quick note on menu. It's very different from a navigation. So a navigation has links that go somewhere, and a menu has buttons that do something. So it's a little bit like the difference between links and buttons. You don't want to use a menu for like the navigation bar that you have at the top of your page, because that contains links. And menus are more like the thing that is in your operating system. So when you right-click, or like the menu bar at the top of your OS, if you're using a Mac. OK, so these are all kind of somewhat good parts. And we'll move on now to what I'll call the bad parts, or the common pitfalls, because that's kind of what they are. They're not necessarily bad, but it's easy to get them wrong. And the first pitfall I want to talk about is actually related to how standard guidance around this works. I used to work at the W3C on some of this guidance, and I have opinions that I want to share. So one common misconception around this is that all these documents are the same. But there is an important difference. So there is the standards, which are also called the normative documents. They are WCAG, they are ATAG, UAG, WAY, ARIA. And then there are the non-normative documents, which is basically everything else you'll find on the W3C website. It's ARIA authoring practices, COGA guidance, understanding docs, and techniques. So all of these documents are not normative, meaning that they haven't gone through the same rigorous standards process that, say, WCAG has gone through. So a new version of WCAG takes years. Even when they say it's done, WCAG 2.2 came out last week, 2 weeks ago. I had a blog post about it 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, that it was almost out. And it surprised me that it took so long. It takes long, because there's lots of processes, and people can file complaints, and then it will be postponed and all that. The not normative documents, on the other hand, they get some rigor, but not a lot of it. And often it's people's personal opinions, which can be very good. They're often very good, because these are passionate people that make good guidance, but just know that they're not the standards. And another thing to know about it is that there are documents on specific standards, not about accessibility as a whole. And that's an important difference to know about. So understanding and techniques are documents that are about WCAG. How do you use WCAG? It's not how do you make accessibility work. It's about how do you use the widgets standard. Same with these ARIA documents. They are about how you use ARIA, not how you build good websites. And it's an important distinction because sometimes you don't need to use ARIA, and these documents are not going to tell you about it because they're a deliverable of the ARIA group. So they're very focused on these specific standards, and that's important to know. Because web accessibility, as mentioned before, is about how people use the web and not about what specific technical standards we have. And your website can impact that through code and not just through like specific code. So it's not just ARIA, it's also HTML, it's SVG, it's JavaScript, it's all of these different things together that make accessible components. And that's important to keep in mind because if you follow these documents, you might end up with way too much ARIA and maybe less accessible things than you would have had otherwise. Again, I have opinions about this. I have a blog post as well that you can read if you want to know more details. That's pitfalls on the standard side. There are also pitfalls in individual websites. One is HTML versus ARIA. Commonly, you want to use HTML if you can. So sometimes HTML will do the ARIA for you. Grab that chance, because the more you can outsource to the browser, the better. There are also sometimes conflicts between UI and the state on the website and like the state in the DOM. So an example of that is a button that is not expanded, but in the DOM, expanded is set to true. It's something I see quite a lot when I inspect websites. It also happened to things that I built because I forgot to test or I forgot to do the thing, and then the state is wrong. And it can cause really big problems. This is a bit of an example that I took that looks simple, but there are more complex examples, of course, to be made. Another example is the current page is not the actual current page. So that happens a lot, and it's annoying for users. So if About Us is visually current, but in the DOM, the product page is set to current, then users are going to be confused, or they get a different experience at least. So that's an issue. Then disappearing focus is an issue. So when something has focus, you need to return it to a logical element whenever that disappears. I'll show you an example as well. So that toggle tip I had earlier with information about BIC and Swift codes, what if I had a button in there? Boom. A button that could focus, and now I close the popover. What basically happens is that the whole thing disappears, including the focused element. So now the answer to the question, where's the focus, is the OK button. But when that disappears, there is no OK button. So what happens? The browser moves the focus to the body element. So it goes kind of to the start of the document. That's OK if you have a small document. If you build a text return document and you're halfway to 1,000 questions, it's super annoying because then it's really hard to find your way back if you're using a screen reader or your keyboard. So the logical element to return it to is basically the button that opened it. So by moving the focus around for the user, you can make a big difference because you're making sure that people don't get lost. By the way, something you get for free with the new Popover API. So if you're using that, it will do that for you. Another thing that I've seen in audits quite a bit is instructions for screen reader users. It's sometimes, maybe you feel like it, but it's usually not a good idea. So you could write a message to your user, say, hello, screen reader user, how are you doing? It's not the thing you want to do because it gets in the way of the user often, and it can also be affected by wrong assumptions because you don't actually know if the label is going to be used by screen reader users or by voiceover users or by lots of different users. They're not all the same. OK, then a couple of roles that I think are interesting to look at. Role equals application. Basically, what that does is that it's going to turn off all the shortcuts that a screen reader comes with. So when you use a screen reader, you can press the H key, and then you go to a heading, and then you press another time, you go to the next heading, and you press another time. You kind of cycle through the headings. Very helpful. I've seen a lot of screen reader users use this as a way to navigate a page, because the headings are probably the most important. It's a bit like landmarks, but out of the box. So even if there are no landmarks and there's still headings, that's a helpful way to navigate. With role equals application, these shortcuts all stop working. And there's a good use case for it. For instance, if you're building the YouTube embed video player thing, you want to put role equals application so that you can take over everything that happens inside of the video player. But most often, we're not building something like that, right? So it's often overused. I guess that's the word of warning I want to give. In many cases where role equals application is used, there are affordances taken away from users, but not really anything useful put back. So do use it with a lot of caution, because it stops the screen user intercepting the shortcut keys. And it's almost never needed. And in some cases, it creates actual barriers, because it means that people can't navigate the way that they plan to navigate. When I gave this talk a few weeks ago in Paris, someone did come up to me who used a screen reader and said, I love the role of application on my YouTube player, which is why I used an example. And they use it because they can change the volume. They can say, I'm going to jump to 15 minutes and 30 seconds, because maybe their friend told them that's a really good part of the video. So YouTube has built in a lot of shortcuts that are actually very helpful and make it worthwhile to actually block out all of the other shortcuts available. Then role description is something that you can use to change what a role is called. So a role of button will be announced as a button. So it will say, OK, here's a button. But what you can do is change that. It's problematic because that doesn't get translated. It can easily increase verbosity. And sometimes it can make things very confusing as well. So I'll quickly show an example of that. So if we have a button that is type of button, we can add ARIA role description to it.
You are currently on web content. Upload photo button. Web content. You are currently on a button inside web content.
So you see it's exposed as a button. Now if I add ARIA role description to it, I can change that to be nonsense and see how it's announced then.
Upload photo nonsense. You are currently on a nonsense inside web content.
So it says you're currently on a nonsense. That's super unhelpful to users, because they don't know what to do with a nonsense. They know what to do with the button, maybe. To VoiceOver's credit, though, they do then announce to click this button, press Control Space. So they actually call it a button still. Maybe they do that so that users know what to do. But yeah, you can imagine this is something where you get a lot of power and maybe a lot of responsibility that you don't want to have. If you change the description of the role, you could affect users quite a bit. Then one more that I wanted to cover is ARIA relevant. I would refer you to the GitHub issue, because with ARIA relevant, people struggle to find actual use cases. So again, if you're using that, do double check if it actually makes sense or not. And with that, I've covered good parts and bad parts, and then there's kind of two parts that are a bit in between. So I've called other parts. I'm not sure how to make my mind up about these. One is ARIA controls. The problem with it is that there's no real consensus around how it should be used by screen reader users. So what kind of things should be announced, for instance, or should anything be announced? Some people say maybe it doesn't need announcements, it's just used for structure. So yeah, it could be useful, but at the moment it isn't actually used by a lot of things. Another one is ARIA owns, which is in theory quite a cool thing. It allows you to say this thing is owned by that thing, but it can lead to a lot of weird implementation details. In the links, I've included a link to a doc by engineers from Chromium that talk about all the different weirdities that they don't know how to solve, like circularity and invalid relationships and stuff like that. So it could be useful, but then it's a little bit hard, and yeah, it has some problems with implementation. So moving on to some takeaways that I hope you will take away from this talk. One is that ARIA adds semantics, but not behavior. So you can add the semantic of a button to a button, but you still need to do lots of other work to make it work. And that's the same for anything you build with ARIA, including autocompletes and sliders and everything. Now, if you use it incorrectly, that's often worse than no use, because you're taking a lot of responsibility by saying, I'm going to make this an autocomplete. Now, when you start to do that, you also have a lot of other tasks, basically, that you could do right or wrong. So going the ARIA route often can give you subtle bugs in support or consistency of support, and they can be quite hard to test. But there are a couple of things, and I've mentioned them in this talk, that are safe to use and that are actually very helpful to end users. So don't be discouraged. You can use ARIA. It is going to be helpful as long as you understand kind of how it fits in the bigger picture of accessibility. And with that in mind, I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. I left those intentionally. I hope that people will actually have some questions after this. So yeah, I want to thank you very much. And there should be a mic as well in the back. Yeah, it's coming to you.
When this is on, when we start using some of those ARIA stuff, for example, ARIA labels, does it already help the user to gradually start supporting adding some labels, or is this becoming worse because if only a part of the page or application is labeled with some ARIA tags?
That's a great question. Yeah, so any label will help. So if the situation before is, I don't know what any of the buttons do, then the situation after is, oh, at least I know what the shopping cart button does. So yeah, any label that you add will make things better. And it's a good way to think about accessibility in general. Like the small steps are going to be helpful. You don't have to get everything right at once. I have a whole talk about you can never get it 100% right, and it's okay. Yeah, that's a good approach, I think. I see a question there.
If you are using these ARIA labels, should you translate them always? And if you don't do that, what's the consequence for the user? If you just leave it in English or another language?
Yeah, if your website is multilingual, you should also translate your labels. Google Translate famously doesn't do that, and I think they're working on it and may have fixed it recently or part of it. But you can assume that translation services won't always do that. A fun fact that I saw at the government is that one of the organizations we work with, they tested with users, and they found out that I think it was like 6% of their users used Google Translate to look at the website because they didn't speak the Dutch language, which many people don't do, but they still had to apply for stuff and wanted to do that. So they used Google Translate, and they couldn't use the labels because they weren't translated by the automated system. So yeah, if you can provide that, that's very helpful. It's also something that's often forgotten about because the labels sit in your DOM, and not everyone looks at the DOM. We do as developers, but yeah, maybe the tester or the designer won't see that there's a problem there because it sits somewhere in your DOM. I see one more question.
Can you recommend a small set of tools that we can use to test it for the users? Because, for example, high contrast modes, or I know NVDA, others maybe?
Yeah, you can use high contrast mode if you're on Windows. It's a little bit trickier on Mac because it's a Windows thing. You can also turn things on Mac that do similar things. When it comes to like using ARIA correctly, you can also use the HTML validator from the W3C because it will point out, oh, you've put a link inside of a menu that is not compatible. It needs to be a menu item or stuff like that, which I find very helpful because I've read the whole ARIA specification a couple of times, I guess, but there are still lots of things in there that I don't remember because it can be confusing. It's full of like compromises and stuff. So to have automated tools that help you figure out which attributes to use when is also very helpful. And there are a bunch of tools that that will do that for you, even in your CI/CD pipeline. So it will tell you if your code is not good.
When a lot of content now is on apps, and I just wonder if you had any thoughts on how that affects ARIA and accessibility.
Yeah, it's a little bit harder to check app accessibility because you can't inspect the DOM. So what I did with the website earlier, where I can just look at like, oh, that's a link and it's got this name, that's a little harder to do with apps, unless they are web apps. That makes it easier. But if they're native apps, then that is harder to see. The same ontology should apply though. So the kind of stuff that you do with ARIA, you should be able to also do with apps. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Any other questions? My last one. All right. Well, then thanks very much for listening. And if you have more questions, feel free to find me afterwards as well.